Wait, Joey Cramer, who played the kid in this movie, robbed a bank this year and went to prison? Jeez, 2016 really is the worst year ever. The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. I had initially planned to begin this new Rewind series with Independence Day, shortly before the sequel was released, but thanks to delays working on another hefty superhero Rewind project, I wasn't able to put it together in time for the new film's release. And considering how wonderfully well-attended and well-received Independence Day Resurgence was, a movie I'd be struggling to even remember I'd seen had I not done an off-the-cuff review just after, I decided not to review the original months after the fact. I may get to it down the road, but in the meantime, I decided to go with a smaller, lesser-known movie about alien abduction set on the 4th of July, the 1986 family film Flight of the Navigator. It's a live-action Disney film that was popular enough there's been talk of a remake as recently as 2012, but obscure enough I'm not sure if it even quite earns the cult classic label. It's a movie I've occasionally discussed with folks my age or a little older as an odd curiosity. We all seem to remember some of the same details. We don't know if we'd ever want to relive it, and we're not totally sure what the point of it was. Kind of like a lot of real-life accounts of alien abductions. I've never talked to anyone who's gone back to this movie or knows it really well. It's like a distant memory or a dream we keep trying to put into focus, except the darn thing's been there the whole time and on the cheap. We could have watched it anytime we wanted. I got my copy for this review for $4. But even when we can remember what the darn thing is called, I think sometimes we prefer to keep some of these childhood curiosities steeped in mystery because we're afraid to risk their not holding up to the mystique the passing years have erected around them. This was certainly one of those movies I was a little let down by after a couple decades, and the unfortunate development of those pesky critical thinking skills. This is one of those weird, mysterious experiences from my childhood, surreal enough that what I remembered about it was as if it had happened to me. And that's the response I think some of these alien kid buddy movies were supposed to evoke for kids. Science fiction was so popular in the 80s, and especially unnerving, atmospheric science fiction, that a lot of kids probably had the same kind of overactive imagination I did. Even if you weren't allowed to watch a movie like Aliens or Predator, a lot of that suspenseful flavor crept into these kid-friendly sci-fi adventure flicks. I didn't just imagine myself peacefully exploring the spaceways on a sleek, luxurious starship. A fairly early memory of mine is a dream in which I look out my bedroom window to see a blinding light. I run outside to investigate, and I find a massive metallic hulk with an open door, inviting me to look inside. I trepidatiously peek in, find nothing but an empty steel cell. Then I turn around to see a horrifying sentinel, clad head to toe in a foreboding armor that matches the cold metal of what I'm just realizing must be a spacecraft. He throws me inside, the door slams shut, the room goes dark, and then I wake up. Probably sounds tame, but at 5 or 6 it was mortifying. And I think the reason it always stuck with me is because in the dream, I wake up to the blinding light, so when I had it, I really thought I was awake. And my imagination went to those kinds of places because I watched movies like this one. Flight of the Navigator was part of a new tradition of sci-fi movies for kids popularized by E.T., and I'm sure it tried to capitalize on a lot of the things that made that movie successful. Finding an extraterrestrial in the woods late at night, a weird but cute alien you're afraid of at first but then think would make for a great pet, and ruthless government agents hell-bent on learning everything they can about this new discovery at the expense of all else, to the point where they seem much scarier than the alien did in the first place. It wasn't enough to daydream about traveling to the stars and seeking out new life. Space is vast. There are billions of galaxies in the universe, and the next closest is 70,000 light years away. Who knows how long it'll take us to learn how to traverse those sorts of distances in any sort of reasonable amount of time. Science fiction is about looking ahead, predicting what will or what could be, guessing what could happen under circumstances that may not be plausible now, but might be possible in the future. But we didn't want to just guess about the future. We wanted desperately to make first contact today. We wanted to imagine what it would be like if aliens showed up on our doorstep and sped up the process for us, like in the day the Earth stood still. And while our heroes didn't have to all be children for us to relate to them or admire them, it was fun to imagine at 8 or 10 or 12 that you were the one who made this incredible discovery. You're still trying to figure out how the world works and what you want to be when you grow up, and if you kind of like or want to run screaming away from any member of the opposite sex. How could you possibly be prepared for such a monumental situation? Before I finally saw it again for this review, I remembered exactly 3 things about this movie. The spaceship shaped like a Nerf football that hangs in the air, as Douglas Adams says, like bricks don't, which has steps that hover off the ground and don't move, and you can move the ship around just by lightly touching it. I remember the terrifying notion of finding oneself several years in the future, your parents middle-aged, your little brother older than you are, and you're not having aged at all. I remember being fascinated by the idea of relative time, that it was possible to travel so fast you would age at a different rate than everyone on Earth. And I remember the Hal-esque robot head with the voice that sometimes sounds like Pee Wee Herman. And what I didn't know until now is that it sounds like Pee Wee Herman because it is Pee Wee Herman. If you ever want to hear the full range of Paul Reubens' vocal talent, watch this movie because he's amazing. I have no idea why he chose to be credited under a pseudonym, Paul Mall, especially if he was going to do the Pee Wee laugh anyway. And I'm not sure why he used that, since it's not an in-story reference to Pee Wee, in a movie that has quite a bit of pop culture references, as Davey probably wouldn't have been familiar with that character in 1978, and Max does that laugh before he downloads the contents of Davey's mind into his databanks. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Flight of the Navigator is simultaneously original and derivative. It has a classic but unique premise, but the box it's packaged in is generic and half-baked. I love the what-if statement here. What if a 12-year-old boy were abducted by aliens, traveled faster than light for a long enough period that several years would pass for his family and friends, but only a few hours for him? What would you do if you found yourself displaced 8 years forward in time? And what would the people around you do? How would people accept a thing that is theoretically possible, but that they couldn't explain with the knowledge and technology on hand? What would the government do? Time dilation is one of the natural issues hard science fiction stories about faster-than-light travel deal with all the time. And it comes up some in the movies, but usually in a futuristic context in which our space travelers have figured out a workaround. So I imagine it was an idea a lot of viewers wouldn't have given a lot of thought before they saw this movie. It captures the initial horror of the situation brilliantly, and that instantly sets it apart from the sort of dilemma Elliot faces in E.T. But the movie doesn't explore that predicament in any interesting way after NASA gets involved, and when Davey is reunited with the spaceship that did this to him, the flight Davey undertakes, while it's played up as a journey of self-discovery and personal growth, is just a plot device to pad the movie out to an hour and a half and try to entertain the kids with a silly robot in a spaceship zipping and darting and freaking people out until the reset button is pressed at the end. It has a fantastic hook and a solid first act, but sort of like Hancock, once it's all about the flimsy mythology that got us here in the first place, the seams start to show. And clearly there's a great idea here, but it has no idea how to execute it. It's a bad free throw shooter. It sets up a great arc, but there's just no follow through. The movie opens with a fake out to subvert the audience's expectations about the alien abduction. The first shot is of a frisbee flying through the air, filmed at a distance and with typical 1950s B sci-fi movie score accompanying it, to make us think we're looking at a flying saucer. Kind of a throwback, again, to the day the Earth stood still. The frisbee gets caught by a dog, and while that's clever enough, the opening credits are hilariously redundant. Frisbee catch after frisbee catch by countless dogs in slow motion. Years before Air Bud, this Disney movie is already using adorable dogs to sate the little kids in the audience. Maybe it thinks that'll make some of the ladies happy too, I don't know. It watches as maybe a little apologetic about the genre and promises there's something here for everyone, but not necessarily that those elements will all gel together. The generic pop theme song doesn't help. It goes on forever and feels like it belongs to a totally different movie. Maybe it would have felt less out of place if it had lyrics like The Never-Ending Story. Flight of the Navigator. Flight of the Navigator. There is perhaps a symbolic component to the dogs catching frisbees, but it's subtle enough I can't tell if it's intentional, and even if the filmmakers had it in mind, it doesn't excuse the monotony of that opening sequence. Davy is trying to teach his mutt how to catch a frisbee to no avail, and seems overly disheartened by it, as if this failure represents his life thus far to him. Davy is a typical 12-year-old. He doesn't get along with his younger brother, he's confused about girls, and of course, his typical dilemmas feel like the end of the world to him. He lives in a big house with, it seems, pretty affluent parents, and his relationship with them seems ideal. They're nurturing, not overly sheltering. To an outsider looking in, his life looks perfect. Yet when he's sent into the woods to look for his brother, he says, "You know what my problem is? I just don't know what I want out of life anymore." He feels like he has no direction, and it's a stretch to make this assumption because there's really no more to it than that. But perhaps he's afraid he's not achieving anything, and he's not sure what he cares to achieve. When he falls in a ravine and wakes up not having aged a day, but to a world and a family that's 8 years older, he finds himself stuck exactly where he was, while everyone else has made almost a decade's worth of progress for themselves. There's a blinking and miss it moment where the dog, I think it's supposed to be the same dog, can catch a frisbee now. Meanwhile, Davy is exactly where he was before, unsure of who he is and who he wants to be, like most 12-year-olds, and in a mortifying twilight zone where the world has moved on without him. So the dog might represent maturity that comes from experience. After all, by the end of the movie, when Davy is returned back in time to the exact moment the spaceship made off with him originally, his memory is left intact and he's all the more grown up for it, appreciating his family, especially his brother, in a way he never could have without the growing pains he lived through in 1986. It isn't the passage of time that makes us smarter, stronger, and better people. It's what we learn from the choices, especially the mistakes, we make. It's a lesson that would be more impactful if we knew more about Davy from the beginning. He kind of seems like a believable real kid, but he's not fully drawn. It watches like he has an internal conflict to work through that's established from the beginning, and he's supposed to resolve it to some degree by the time he's returned to his time. But it's ambiguous at best and generic at worst. I think maybe Davy is frustrated with his age, impatient with time, like his lack of patience with his dog. If only he was grown up already, he'd know how to talk to girls, he wouldn't have to put up with his stupid little brother, and he'd know what the heck he wanted out of life. I don't need a character's motivations to be spelled out in neon lights, but it's difficult to read without it being made more explicit. I'm not sure if this is a be careful what you wish for situation, like Tom Hanks' Big, or if he's just given a couple of arbitrary and mundane problems to overcome so he can go through the obligatory character arc. My favorite character in the film is Davy's little brother, then suddenly much older brother, Jeff. And I think the movie's biggest mistake is not making the crux of the story about that relationship. Jeff embodies Davy's character arc, an irritating little troublemaker who grows up into a caring, mature, and responsible young man. The skeleton of this dynamic is a good one. Davy is most horrified at meeting the 17-year-old version of that 9-year-old twerp he couldn't stand, even more horrified than he was at seeing his parents middle-aged and graying. He thought he hated his little brother, but now he's realizing those feelings were more complex. This is another thing that might have been brought more to the forefront, but I think Davy, deep down, liked the responsibility and expectations that came with being the older brother. And now all of that's been taken away from him. Imagine having to finish your childhood after your kid brother, who you were expected to look after, has already lived his, and requiring his guidance based on the life experience you should have had already to get through it. Jeff becomes Davy's initial source of encouragement and reassurance, and it's appropriate that he guides Davy back home at the end after he gets lost in his spaceship and can't find his way. When he returns to 1978 and tells Jeff that he loves him, it's not just because of the kind of person he knows Jeff is going to become. It's because he looked up to that Jeff and is grateful for the opportunity to be the big brother, an opportunity he thought was stolen from him and one he took for granted the first time around. And maybe Davy knows that he has a greater responsibility in this timeline because he's seen the potential Jeff achieved without him, possibly partly because of the difficult time he and his parents had to endure after Davy disappeared. I get the sense that Jeff stepped up to fill the eldest son role and help his parents cope after the traumatic loss of his brother, with zero clues as to what happened to him. So it's important for Davy to help his brother fulfill that potential with encouragement and nurturing, rather than the constant berating that probably contributed to his prolonged immaturity. The more I'm talking about it, I'm finding myself actually appreciating this easy, tied up with a bow ending. The problem is, what I'm describing is only the setup and resolution, which would be all the more effective if the meat of the story was fleshing out those interpersonal relationships. Instead, the crux of the story's middle, where the confrontation usually goes in a 3-act story, is a weird meandering road trip with a government after the truth plot that never really goes anywhere. I've rarely encountered a movie where the film's title concept is ultimately less interesting than the conceit it needs to get it there. I found myself wanting the movie to focus on how the kid copes with the time displacement, and maybe how the knowledge he brings to the future with him affects the culture at large. And while the design of the ship is stunning and stuck with me all this time, I found everything having to do with it arbitrary and tacked on. The movie is called Flight of the Navigator, but that part seems like it should be the setup to facilitate another story. The whole thing watches backwards to me. Sure, that sleek silver spacecraft flying all over the planet with government agents after it is the exciting sci-fi premise that would have enticed anyone to see this movie. And I realize I'm advocating for the likely unsellable art house film, at least to this movie's intended audience. But I can't help but suspect that the space adventure part, or I guess the Earth adventure featuring a spaceship, was superglued on top of a more intimate, serious, and more authentically science fiction story. Either that, or these screenwriters wrote themselves into a corner and spent the rest of their movie concocting cheap explanations for the premise they'd established and cheap setups for the squeaky clean ending they thought a Disney movie is supposed to have. On paper, Max teaches Davy about humanity and maturity by his counterexample. He doesn't understand a lot of the things that make life worth living for Davy, especially humor, and once he copies Davy's mind, he becomes a mirror for Davy. This obedient, no-nonsense, mission-driven machine suddenly becomes a child, needy and attention-seeking. He immediately starts taking things personally and tries to teach Davy a vindictive lesson when he sends the ship careening toward the ground and forces Davy to figure out how to pilot it in the moment, after an argument about who the inferior one is. They develop a bond and ostensibly teach each other a lot. Max helps Davy to grow up a little, and Davy helps Max discover a personality, to be more than the sum of his parts. The problem is, Max is introduced too late into the story, and they don't have enough meaty discussion about what each of them has that the other could gain. Most of the situations they find themselves in together feel like quick gags rather than a real progression of a relationship. They freak out some kids in a car on the highway, they freak out a gas station owner and a family that pulls up, just a lot of flying around aimlessly, having no idea how to get to Fort Lauderdale and freaking people out. It might be a fun, absurd situation. I was getting both Bill and Ted and Follow That Bird vibes, but it takes away from a much more intriguing story about a kid lost in time. There might have been a good escape from the alien into something even more alien story here, but Davy doesn't find a home with Max. He's trying to get back home the whole time. Sure, by the end, he decides there's no place for him in 1986 and convinces Max to take what's supposed to be an extreme risk in traveling back in time to his old life. But I don't understand why he was in such a hurry to get home in the first place. Yes, returning to his family is all he wants, and NASA stands in the way of that. Dr. Faraday, your average government scientist hell-bent on unraveling the mysteries of the universe at any cost, is pushing the boundaries of human rights in order to learn everything he can about where Davy was those 8 years, and once he has him, to discover all the secrets Max locked up in his head when the ship picked him up in 1986. Davy has this sudden realization when Max gets him back to his parents' house and he sees Faraday, that he's going to be poked and prodded his whole life. I know he's just 12, and he's been discombobulated by all the insanity he woke up to, what with finding out the world moved on 8 years ahead without him, there's other life in the universe, and time travel is possible, all in the span of a couple days. But I kind of think this would have occurred to him sometime during his joyride. When he escaped from the NASA compound, with the help of an intern played by Sarah Jessica Parker of all people, who really shouldn't have been allowed anywhere near him if he's so top secret, especially since they didn't tell her thing one about him, but let her talk directly to him as she brought him his meals and such. What did he think would happen? Davy has to know Faraday can find his way to Fort Lauderdale. He's trying to get home. That's the first place NASA's going to think to look for him. Maybe initially he thought his parents and his basic constitutional rights might save him, but it's odd that he decides nothing but time travel can allow him a normal life after he's gone through hell to get back home. Well, not hell, exactly, really just a lot of backseat driving and sightseeing. Maybe that's the problem. He was just having so much fun fooling around with a futuristic and insanely powerful spacecraft, and the immediate stakes were so low that he kind of forgot what exactly the situation was. I don't think that's what's supposed to be going on, but that could work, again, if Davy was trying to escape from his problems and in the end were forced to face up to them. But his endgame, the whole time, is to get back home. What begins as an intriguing mystery turns into a clunky dot-to-dot picture as the movie attempts to explain why Max came for him in the first place. Some super advanced civilization from a planet called Phalon sent out a fully automated vessel to collect living specimens, study them, and return them from where they came from unharmed. Davy happens to be the subject the ship studies from Earth. Okay, so far so good. But once we find out about the maps in his head, things start to get really contrived. Max wanted to see how much information a human brain could store, so he uploads his ship's databanks, including all of its star charts and ship schematics, to Davy's brain. When Davy asks about the results of the experiment, Max says it leaked. And that's where he gets off calling Davy an inferior being. Good thing all the maps were intact. I wonder what the Phalons are like. Would Max consider them inferior beings? Are the people of Phalon still calling the shots? Or is it a planet of artificial intelligence? Max doesn't understand anything about human emotion. Are Phalons that different from humans? Has he not interacted with Phalons enough? Is he not programmed to comprehend such things? Or are there no Phalons left? Max deems it too dangerous for Davy to time travel back to where he found him, which is his general protocol. So he leaves him in the same place, but 8 years later, to when they've traveled relatively because of the time displacement caused by lightspeed travel. This begs a basket of questions. First, why is it necessary for the ship to travel at warp speed in order to conduct its experiments? Maybe some of those experiments would necessitate a trip back to the homeworld. Maybe some of them are related to the effects of lightspeed travel on different species. But this one isn't. As far as I can tell, everything Max does to Davy could be done right there in the woods without traveling an inch. Secondly, what is it about the other specimens that make it safe for them to endure time travel, but not a human being? It seems like a pretty uncommon thing for creatures to not be physically ready to travel through time, as this seems to be pretty routine business for Max and the Phalons. Third, wouldn't you want to make sure your subject could safely make the trip if you're so concerned about its well-being before you decide it's a candidate for your experiments? At what point does Max come to realize Davy's body might be too fragile for time travel? He says it as a point of fact, but I'm not sure how he reaches that conclusion. Did he know that the whole time? Or was there some kind of test he decided to run later? Davy asks why he was chosen, and Max says, why not? Well, for starters, he might die if you take him through time, and you seem programmed with a moral aversion to disrupting the natural order of whatever planet you visit. 4. How does the time travel work? What makes it more dangerous to Davy than lightspeed travel? The ending is, of course, crossing the streams in Ghostbusters. It's said to be incredibly dangerous, could result in total catastrophe, and then the big finish is we take that risk and everything works out fine. I'm not sure that Davy's really displaying any kind of personal growth with this decision either. It seems like the grown-up thing to do would be to accept what's happened to him and make the best of it. Trust his parents to do whatever they can to help him have a normal life. That might sound cold. After all, he really could be under a microscope his whole life. But is the risk worth it? Not knowing he's in a movie with a script that won't let him die and is plotting this part for him so he can live happily ever after, Davy should consider what it would do to his family if the plan backfired. They would go through the anguish of losing him all over again, not to mention all the alterations he might make to the timeline. Who's to say he's making a better future for anyone but him if he goes back? He's preventing his family from having to go through the drama of his being missing for 8 years, sure, but he doesn't know what joys or worthwhile experiences he's taking from them by changing the past. Remember, it's not like this is an alternate future he's created by a time travel scenario in the first place. Davy didn't move forward in time, he experienced time differently than everyone on Earth, which is a huge difference. So if he goes back in time, he's creating a new timeline, not repairing the original. So his going back is maybe a little selfish, especially since his being there could cause a ripple effect that changes a lot of other people's lives beyond his parents' perfect lakeside home. And while we aren't told explicitly why Max brings back every creature to the moment he finds them, as I said, the only logical conclusion I can draw is a sort of non-interference directive, or at least a commitment to not harm the creatures themselves. I mean, you can't really know if you're going to accidentally lobotomize the kid when you put all your data in his head, but I guess Max uses every precaution when performing digital brain surgery. So I also can't help but question Max's decision to abide Davy's wishes and take him back in time, since that could fundamentally alter Earth's history. Yeah, he's already done that by taking Davy out in the first place and flying the ship all over the place. No idea why Max isn't concerned with anyone seeing the ship, and of course, if this happened today, everyone on the planet would know about the ship as soon as a couple people posted videos to YouTube. But Max returns Davy with all the knowledge he's accumulated about the ship and Phelan to 1978. Maybe he never tells anyone, maybe no one would believe him, but I'd think Max would be a little concerned about the damage he's done to history. But again, he's also not concerned with anyone seeing his ship, so maybe not. It's also possible that he's not taking any logic into account because he's more concerned with his friend's wishes and well-being now that he's got all that 12-year-old human thinking in him. And the way Davy and Max meet up in the first place is as contrived as the time travel conceit. Max had already resigned himself to the fact that he couldn't take Davy back in time, so that would have been the end of it for him, just cut his losses and fly on. Except he studied some flowers, crashed, and lost his star charts. I love that everything else works, including the time travel mechanism, but he doesn't know how to get home. So he has to go find Davy and re-download the information he put in his brain. Gee, lucky he was conducting a brain download experiment this time. If he had been studying human child shoe tying capabilities, he'd be out of luck. I don't understand this arrangement Max has initially with Davy. What about having star charts in your brain that are easily put back in the ship's computer makes you the Navigator? The ship is its own Navigator once that information is back in its databanks. Yet not only does Max keep referring to him that way, mostly for the gag that the kid who's supposed to be navigating doesn't know his own way home, but until he gets a taste of human defiance, Max also treats Davy as the ship's captain, obeying his every command, always responding with compliance. Reminds me of the computer voice at the beginning of Star Fox levels.
Good luck.
What qualifies Davy to give the ship commands? This is a movie ripe for a good remake. I'd be interested to see if these two ideas could be more effectively integrated, and it would immediately be a different story because you can't have a kid flying around in a spaceship for 40 minutes and not knowing how to get home in a smartphone GPS world. There's an excellent family drama in here somewhere with a lot of interesting ideas proposed by this premise that the movie doesn't take the time to explore. There are some fun moments with Davy and Max, like Davy teaching Max about what, by his definition, is music. The Beach Boys are, opera is not. And that could have been the sort of moving relationship Elliot and E.T. had, but it starts too late and interrupts a totally different story that isn't about a computer learning what it is to be human, but rather a coming-of-age story for a boy who comes to appreciate his growing pains when the world passes him by. I'm giving Flight of the Navigator a 2 out of 4.
Next time on Science Fiction Rewind. Oh, isn't that lovely?